This is the true story, assembled from eyewitness accounts of the dramatic events in Surrey that would trigger a national scandal involving the scheming of England's most senior judge, his illustrious and determined wife, and their traumatized daughter. On a summer evening in mid-July 1617, a group of around a dozen men, armed with pistols, left London hurriedly on horseback and rode over the bridge into Surrey. Their destination was Ashley House in Oatlands, a few miles beyond Hampton Court, and their mission was to abduct a 14-year-old girl who had been hidden there by her mother in order to avoid a forced marriage. Following behind the riders in his coach was the child's father, Sir Edward Coke, until recently Lord Chief Justice of the King's Bench, the most important judge in the country. In a separate coach, because they were not on speaking terms, his wife, Lady Elizabeth Hatton, was also in pursuit, desperate to arrive before her husband, and shouting at the driver to go as fast as possible, insisting that she would pay any recompense should the horse collapse of exhaustion. If the threat of violence and bloodshed had not been present, this could have been a scene from a comedy at one of the London playhouses. Cook had discovered his daughter, Frances, missing from the family home at Hatton House in Holborn that morning, and, in a panic that his carefully negotiated plans with the Villiers family could be in jeopardy, had sent out his spies to find out where she had been taken. Suspecting that relatives of his wife might be involved, 2 of his men were sent to Ashley House. This was a large red brick mansion, which was being rented by Lady Hatton's cousin, set in the middle of extensive parkland bordering Oatlands Palace. An unsuspecting servant told them that a coach had indeed arrived in the early hours of the morning, with a young woman on board. Some hours later, the horsemen, led by Cook's eldest son, Robert, arrived at the gatehouse of Ashley House and decided to wait for Cook as requested. When the coaches of the warring parents arrived, there was a scuffle, and Lady Hatton stood in front of the gates, proclaiming boldly that her husband would have to spill her blood before she would give way. Ignoring the pleas of his wife, Cook gave the order to break down the gates, and then banged loudly on the front door, waving his warrant, and bellowing in the same loud voice that he used in court, that he had the right to enter, on the orders of the king himself. There was no answer, but a window to the side of the building had been left slightly open, and they were able to gain entry. The group of 12 men rushed into the entrance hall, pistols drawn. At this point, Edmund Witherpole, his wife, and their servants came out of the shadows, pleading for calm as there were 12 children in the house. The intruders fanned out, and the sound of boots reverberated up the oak staircase and along the corridors until there was a cry of anguish from upstairs, and Frances Cook was found, hiding in a closet. She had been terrified by the banging, and the loud voices, and the footsteps coming nearer. As she was presumed complicit in her own concealment, she was roughly handled by her stepbrother, dragged downstairs past her furious father and distraught mother, and bundled into Sir Edward Cook's coach. Escorted by the cavalry, they made their way back through the parkland in the fading light, heading for Robert Cook's house in Kingston. Sir Edward Cook's career had previously gone from strength to strength. He had become a Privy Councillor and been appointed Lord Chief Justice of the King's Bench. However, in his passion for the common law, he had frequently opposed King James's royal prerogative, which resulted, in late 1616, in his dismissal from office. For someone whose legal career meant everything, he became a desperate man in exile. In his newly miserable state, it struck him that if he arranged a marriage between his daughter, Frances, and John Villiers, who was the brother of the king's new favourite, George Villiers, known as the Duke of Buckingham, he might obtain Buckingham's support and therefore by association, please the king. Everyone would gain from this plan. He, Cook, would have his old job back, and John Villiers would become a prosperous man with a beautiful young bride. The fact that Sir Edward Coke and Lady Hatton had a tempestuous marriage only added fuel to the fire. Coke was utterly devoted to the law and possessed a temperament that even his friends would admit was arrogant, obnoxious and overbearing. Whilst Lady Hatton came from an illustrious family, the Cecils, and was a wealthy widow in her own right and fiercely protective of how her inheritance was to be bestowed. The major problem was that Coke did not tell his wife of his plans for their daughter until the wedding negotiations had been finalized. So when he announced the fait accompli, Lady Hatton had silently removed Frances to her cousin's house in Oatlands that same night. Lady Hatton's legal advisor suggested she should complain to the Privy Council. The 8 members met at Whitehall Palace, where Lady Hatton presented her petition, in which she protested, as was recorded, in somewhat of a passionate and tragical manner, that due to her daughter's weak constitution, she had sent her to her cousin's house for the country air. Informed of the violence used to abduct her, which legally was classified as a riot, as it was a violent and unlawful act by more than 3 people, the Privy Council dispatched a messenger to Kingston to order Coke to bring his daughter immediately to London to seek medical help. Coke promised to deliver her the next morning, but this did not satisfy Lady Hatton, who just wanted her daughter back in her own care. Lady Hatton did not rest during the night, but instead, taking a leaf from her husband's book, organized her own cavalry. With the support of several of her allies, 60 men on horseback, all armed, assembled at first light on the main road outside Wandsworth, between Kingston and London. Here they stood and waited, scanning the road ahead, until it was clear that Sir Edward Coke was not coming. Whether he had been tipped off, or was simply taking precautions, Coke had left by a different route, heading over Kingston Bridge and approaching London through Middlesex. A commentator wrote that a notable skirmish had been narrowly avoided. The events at Oatlands might have remained private, had Lady Hatton not resolved, in her distress, to seek help from the Privy Council, from where news soon leaked out. Already, barely a week later, the story had become public in the nave of St. Paul's Cathedral and amongst the booksellers outside in the churchyard, which had become the marketplace for news and gossip. Rumours and hearsay distorted the facts to favour whichever side was supported. Either the husband and his God-given rights over his wife and children, or the wife and her quest for justice in the face of broken promises concerning her inheritance. In truth, all that really mattered was the king's perspective, and he was in Scotland for several weeks, accompanied by the handsome young Buckingham. Letters to, and from, his private secretary were taking a week or more to arrive, so there were periods of high tension among the Privy Councillors in London, where rival factions were sending their own version of events north, by post. Half of the council had been affected by Lady Hatton's pleading, and had little regard for Sir Edward Coke, having been on the receiving end of his temper, and were inwardly pleased that he had had a comeuppance. The other half believed the king's passion for Buckingham would tip his support in favour of Coke's wedding plans with the Villiers family. Everyone was on edge. Appearing to contradict the king could easily be portrayed by enemies at court as treason, with dire consequences. When his response was finally revealed, King James's regal declaration was that it was the hiding of Frances Coke from her father that was the greatest offence, and that the violence at Ashley House was simply the effort required to redress the situation. A commission was to be set up, and in the meantime, Frances was to remain under Coke's guardianship. Warrants were issued for the arrest of those involved in the so-called abuses of removing Frances Coke from her father, including for Lady Hatton who, as a woman of noble birth, was confined to a house of a former Lord Mayor of London. It was August, and with her freedom curtailed, Lady Hatton changed tactics, claiming to have a letter from the Earl of Oxford, proving that Frances Coke was already betrothed to him. He was conveniently abroad in Italy, on a grand tour, and could not be contacted for confirmation. Edward Cook was quick to act. Within days, a letter from Frances addressed to her mother was made public. She wrote,
"Dear Mother, I am now aware that as a mere child, I do not understand the world or what is good for myself. And so I retract my opposition to marrying John Villiers. Believe me that no violent means have been used to me by words or deeds."
This afterthought had been added to counter rumours circulating St. Paul's that the notoriously violent Cook had beaten his daughter into submission by tying her to a bedpost and the use of a whip. By early September, Lady Hatton was unable to provide the original letter from the Earl of Oxford, so it was judged a forgery. The path to the marriage of Frances Cook and John Villiers was now clear of all obstructions. The ceremony took place in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court, where the Villiers family was present, as were Cook's sons and daughters from his first marriage. Lady Hatton sent a message that she was sick. Sir Edward Cook, with a merry countenance, led his daughter halfway down the aisle, before handing her over to King James, who handed her in turn to Sir John Villiers. This act neatly encapsulated the events of the past few weeks, and the culmination of his plan. Within days, Cook brought formal charges against his troublesome wife, who was reported to be still in her confinement and crazy in body and sick in mind. In anticipation of an appearance before the Star Chamber, Lady Hatton prepared a speech in which she laid out the gravity of her husband's offence and its logical conclusion.
Everything else pales into insignificance to Sir Edward Cook's most notorious riot, committed at the house in Oatlands, where, without proper warrant, and associated with a dozen well-weaponed fellows, he took down the doors of the gatehouse, and of the house itself, and tore the daughter, in that barbarous manner, from her mother. For if it is lawful for him, who had been the Chief Justice of the law, to enter any man's house so outrageously, with a dozen men, then it is lawful for any man, with 100, nay, with 500 men, to do the same, which may endanger the safety of the king's person, and the peace of the kingdom.
But there was to be no trial. Lady Hatton knew she was beaten. Her only hope of freedom was to formally accept the marriage and bestow her inheritance on her newlywed daughter. With this change of heart, King James released Lady Hatton, and soon she was hosting dinner parties again at Hatton House, where she invited family and friends who had stood by her. But she was never reconciled with her husband. She was overheard to say of him,
"I would rather be friends with the devil."
Sir Edward Cook was restored to the Privy Council, but he did not become Chief Justice again. To commentators, his was a victory that had come at a heavy cost to his already flawed reputation. Amidst all the shenanigans, little was known of how the selfish actions of her domineering parents had impacted Frances Cook, now all of 15, and what lasting emotional damage had been caused. It would come as no surprise, though, to learn that her marriage to John Villiers was not a success. His health was fragile, and Frances did not stand by him. Instead, she took a lover, with whom she had an illegitimate child, causing yet another scandal, and resulting in a warrant for her arrest on adultery charges. As a consequence, she fled into exile, spending several years in Paris. More details of these dramatic events, including transcripts of personal letters and reports from contemporary commentators, can be found in a 60-page booklet titled The Most Notorious Riot in Surrey, 1617, available from the casacolori.co.uk website.